Hey everyone, I'm Chris and you're watching Mudwalkers. This episode is brought to you by my wonderful patrons on Patreon. Wonderful supporters on Patreon. That comes off the tongue a little bit better. All right. Today, as you can see in our title, we're looking at 1 Timothy chapter 2. Once again, I haven't opened it up to the proper page. Okay. Now we're just going to hone in on a couple sentences here. What we're looking at is Paul's instructions to men and women. He says, I desire then that in every place that men should pray, lifting holy hands, sacred hands, without anger or quarreling. Likewise also that women should adorn themselves in respectable clothing, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. So, often in modesty conversations, what you'll hear is, women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control. We stop there, forgetting that the context of this also includes Paul's instructions for men, not just for women. Not just for women. But it also leaves out the second part of the sentence. You know, the gold and pearls, etc. The braided hair. The braided hair is especially important, by the way. So why did women in the Greco-Roman region in the first century, particularly among the actual Greco-Roman peoples, like the Romans, like the Greeks, people living around Ephesus in Asia Minor at the time, the reason that they did this was there was a sort of pecking order among the women. If you were the best dressed, the best hair, etc., then you were the belle of the ball. You ran the coop. You ran the roost. That's the term. And you were essentially the queen of the room. It was a way of competing with one another, of one-upping each other, of putting each other down, putting you in your place, shoving you down so I can rise to the top. So Paul is hearing about this. Paulos is hearing about this from Timothy. And Paul is understandably upset by this because Paul, one of his big emphases in the New Testament is equality. There is no rankings. There's no what's the term? There is no class system in Christianity. You are a Christian or you are not. That's it. There are no class distinctions in Christianity. Paul saw him as basically the same kind of person as everyone else. So the idea that some of these women would try to beat other women down so that they themselves could win this higher status in the church disgusted him. So, what's his solution? You women should dress like the rest. Now, why is the braided hair important? The braided hair is important because that was an upper crust thing for a woman to do, because it took time for them to arrange their hair that way. Often these rich women would actually have their servants or slaves do their hair for them because it was so elaborate. Some of these hairstyles were really tall, like Victorian tall. They were very elaborate. So this was not just an opulent show of wealth that was kind of not too kind to the poor Christians in the room who didn't have what these people had. But on top of that, it was a way, like I said, of beating other women down so that these women could actually be jettisoned to the top of the social hierarchy. So what Paul is getting at here is that Christian gatherings are not a place for social ladder climbing. To the contrary, they're a place for family-like equality. He calls us brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, elders and grandchildren. It's all one big family. It's supposed to be more like a family reunion. Everyone comes together. Everyone eats together. You could just wear your PJs because we're kin. We're family. We can be ourselves. We can be equals. We can be brothers and sisters, not some kind of magistrate and her subjects. That's what this passage is really getting at. And that is a message that I think Christianity can learn from in every era, is that we need to operate as equals. So, in the end, 1 Timothy chapter 2 is not relevant at all to the question of whether or not people should wear clothes, or even defining what modesty is in terms of skin exposure. The text is completely irrelevant. So, Today's episode of Mudwalkers is brought to you by the generous donations of my supporters on Patreon. Naturism, Todd, Jacob, Brian, Jordan, Benjamin, Jay Sweets, and Alex. Thank you all so much for supporting me on Patreon. You guys are helping keep Mudwalkers sustainable. I want to keep growing the channel. I want to make bigger and better content as I go. At some point, hopefully I'll be able to do things that right now are not anywhere on the channel. Just I don't want to say too much, but hopefully I'll be able to do bigger, better things as time goes on and I get more support on Patreon. This has already been an immense amount of support on Patreon, more than I realistically expected. So I'm looking forward to getting with you guys on Patreon and going over everything. I'm letting you know what my plans are going forward and how Patreon can grow and what my plans are for the rest of the year. If you haven't checked out my Patreon, there's a link down below for you to check it out. We have a $5 tier and a $10 tier. Super affordable. You can come in for 1 month, support me for $10, and you can get back out. You'll get a patron shout out like you just saw. I'll give your Patreon handle a shout out here. You can change it if you don't want your Patreon handle right now put out on a video, or you can just send me a direct message on Patreon saying, hey, just exclude me from the shout out and I'll exclude you from the shout out. No big deal. The $5 tier and $10 tier both get early access to all my videos. As soon as they go online, you'll be able to see them before anybody else does, because my videos get uploaded and then scheduled to release at a later date. So sometimes my patrons will see my videos a week, 2 weeks, a month in advance. You get that as my patrons. Everyone gets access to the videos, but you get to see them before anybody else does. Also, the $10 tier has access to a monthly Zoom conversation with me. I call it a circular conversation. We're hanging out. Yes, there'll be some things that I talk about from my personal life or what's going on with me at the time. Maybe there even might be some things you guys want to ask me or stories that I want to tell. But mostly, I want to hang out. I want to hear from you. I want to hear your questions, hear your stories, what's going on in your life. I want you guys to be able to talk to each other. I want this to become an online community, a real community. But we can't do that with me on one side of the screen and you on a keyboard. I want to be able to do this on a much deeper level. And I think the Zoom Hangouts are a great way to do that. That'll be all for this episode of Mudwalkers, and I will see you in the next one.